everyone. Today we're going to be presenting our research on housing insecurity among Canadian workers and examining how employment law and tenant law reform can improve affordability and housing stability as well. So housing affordability has become one of the most discussed social and economic issues in Canada. Many people, they still think of it as strictly a housing problem, but our research suggests that employment conditions also play a major role in this. Many Canadians are working, but they still struggle to afford stable housing due to many factors such as rising costs, insecure employment, and also limitations in existing legal protections. So throughout this presentation, we're going to be exploring the relationship between employment and housing, identifying some of the legal gaps that contribute to housing insecurity, and discuss reforms that can overall help improve outcomes for Canadian workers, which is essentially what our research question and main argument aims to answer as well. So to begin, it's very important to understand what housing insecurity means. Housing insecurity occurs when individuals or families, they struggle to obtain or maintain housing that's safe, stable, and also affordable. And this can include difficulty paying rent, being at risk of eviction, or even moving very frequently because housing has become so unaffordable, or they might be living in housing that doesn't meet their needs. I would say housing insecurity, it essentially exists on a spectrum. So a person doesn't necessarily have to be homeless to experience housing insecurity. Many Canadians who have housing can still face constant uncertainty about whether they will be able to keep their house or not. Overall, the last several years, housing affordability has become a major challenge across Canada. There's been rising rents, housing shortages, and also increases in the overall cost of living, which have placed significant pressure on households. And these challenges have essentially been difficult, especially for low-income workers, minimum wage employees, also gig workers, and also just individuals who are working in temporary or contract positions. Which again connects back to our research question of how can employment law and housing law reform help address housing insecurity among Canadian workers. Our argument is that housing insecurity should not be viewed solely as a housing issue. Rather, employment conditions, wages, job security, and also tenant protections all affect a person's ability to secure and maintain housing. Therefore, meaningful solutions must address both employment and housing policy together. Housing insecurity among Canadian workers. So this slide will focus on why housing insecurity should be viewed through a worker-focused lens. So one of the biggest challenges facing workers today is affordability pressure. Housing costs have increased very dramatically in many communities, while many workers continue to earn wages that haven't really kept pace with those increases. And as a result, we have a large growing portion of income that's also being spent on rent and housing-related expenses. For many workers, this is creating very difficult choices. Individuals may have to reduce spending on food, transportation, healthcare, education, or savings simply to afford housing. And this can make households extremely vulnerable to unexpected expenses or even financial emergencies. Housing insecurity can also affect a person's ability to remain employed. Workers who are forced to move because of rising rents, they may face longer commutes, transportation challenges, or even disruptions to childcare arrangements. And housing instability can also increase stress and also negatively affect physical and mental health of an individual. Another important point is that housing insecurity and employment insecurity, they often reinforce one another. So if a worker loses hours, they lose a job or experiences unstable income, paying rent also becomes more difficult. And at the same time, unstable housing can make it harder to maintain employment. And because of this relation, our research suggests that coordinated legal reform is necessary And addressing housing without addressing employment conditions leaves part of the problem essentially unresolved. A major factor contributing to housing insecurity is the growing gap between housing costs and wages. So we see this trend of rent rising faster than wages across many Canadian cities. Rent prices have increased at a much faster rate than wages, and while workers may receive occasional raises or minimum wage increases, those increases often fail to keep pace with the cost of housing. And this means that many households are spending a larger percentage of their income on housing than in previous years. As housing consumes more of a worker's income, fewer resources remain available also for other necessities. We also have things like low vacancy rates that have added to this challenge. And in many urban areas, rental units are limited, increasing competition among renters. So when demand starts to exceed supply, renters have fewer affordable options available to them. Income volatility also plays a huge role. We have workers in gig, contract, and part-time employment who often do not earn a predictable income each month. And these fluctuating hours and inconsistent earnings make it difficult to budget and plan for housing expenses. So the consequences of these affordability pressures extend beyond housing itself. Financial stress can also affect mental health, family stability, workplace performance. So research increasingly suggests that housing affordability has become a long-term structural issue rather than just a temporary problem.
Housing insecurity is also a work issue, so this slide it highlights why housing insecurity should also be understood as an employment issue. Certain groups of workers are more vulnerable than others. Minimum wage workers, gig workers, temporary employees, and contract workers often experience unstable schedules and unpredictable earnings. These conditions make it way more difficult to secure and maintain stable housing. Although employment laws provide important protections, there are still gaps in practice. Like, for example, dispute over workers' classification can leave workers without access to protections that traditional employees receive. Unpredictable scheduling and fluctuating hours can also create income instability. Housing insecurity affects employers as well as employees. Workers experiencing housing instability may face increased stress, longer commutes, difficulty with attendance, and reduced productivity. From an economic perspective, housing insecurity can contribute to higher turnover rates and lower workforce stability. And this demonstrates how the housing affordability is not simply a personal issue, but also a labor market issue that affects businesses and the broader economy. Ontario Tenant Protections and Gaps. Ontario's Residential Tenancies Act provides several important legal protections for tenants. These protections include limits on most annual recent rent increases, requirements for notice before eviction, and procedures that landlords must follow through the landlord and tenant fraud. There are also rules intended to prevent bad faith evictions in certain circumstances. These protections play an important role in promoting housing stability. However, they do not completely eliminate housing insecurity. One limitation is that legal protections can't solve affordability problems on their own. So a worker must have legal rights as a tenant, but still struggle to pay rent because wages are too low or employment is unstable. Another challenge is enforcement. So some tenants may not be aware of their rights, while others may have the resources necessary to pursue legal remedies. Delays within administrative processes can also make it difficult for tenants to obtain timely solutions. As a result, there remains a gap between legal protections that exist on paper and the realities faced by many low-income workers. This is one reason why broader reform is necessary. Proposed legal reforms. Our research identified several legal reforms that could help address housing insecurity among Canadian workers. The first recommendation is strengthening wage protections. Raising wage floors and improving minimum wage policies could help ensure that earnings better reflect the actual cost of living. So, a second recommendation is improving protections for gig workers and other precarious workers. These workers often face income volatility and limited legal protections. Expanding access to employment rights could improve financial stability. Third, stronger enforcement of Employment Standard Act's protections would help ensure that workers actually receive the rights and benefits that they're entitled to under the law. On the housing side, increasing access to affordable housing is essential. This could involve expanding affordable houses programs, increasing housing supply, and supporting non-market housing initiatives. And finally, strengthening tenant safeguards could help reduce unfair displacement and provide greater stability for renters. Together, these reforms would address both income insecurity and housing insecurity rather than just focusing on only one side of the issue. Why reform matters? So legal reform matters because the benefits extend far beyond individual workers. First, stronger employment and housing protections can reduce housing insecurities and decrease the likelihood of homelessness and or also forced displacement. Second, housing stability contributes to greater economic stability. Families with predictable housing costs are better able to budget, save money, and plan for the future. Third, stable housing supports workforce productivity. Workers who have secure housings are generally better positioned to attend work consistently and also focus on their responsibilities and remain employed over the long term. And there's also broader community benefits, so that those are reducing housing insecurities can lower demand on shelters, emergency services, and social assistance programs. It can also contribute to healthier and more connected communities. So ultimately, investing in stronger worker protections and housing policy benefits not only individuals but also society as a whole. So in conclusion, housing insecurity is a growing issue affecting many Canadian workers. Our research shows that rising housing costs, wage stagnation, precarious employment, and limitations in existing legal protections all contribute to housing insecurity. Low-income and precarious workers often experience the greatest challenges because they face both housing affordability and pressures and employment instability. While tenant protections provide important safeguards, housing insecurities can't be fully addressed through the housing policy alone. Employment law reforms that improve wages, strengthens worker protections, and increase income stability must also be part of the solution. So the key takeaway from our research is that housing insecurity is not just a housing issue, it's also an employment issue. So addressing both areas through coordinated legal reforms offers the greatest opportunity to overall improve affordability, housing stability, and overall the quality of the life for Canadian workers.
Thank you for listening to our presentation, and we'd be happy to answer any questions anyone has.